This is the Soccer Pass Skills Training Program by Rory and Steph. Using the one-dimensional classification scheme, a soccer pass can be classified as a discrete skill, a gross motor skill, and an open skill. The skill is classified as discrete because it has one distinct movement and an identifiable beginning and end. It's a gross motor skill because it requires large muscle groups and large actions, and it's an open skill because the learner must act according to changes in environment. This means that they must react to where the ball is in order to control it and then release it. The skill will initially be practiced in closed conditions until the learner becomes more comfortable.
The aim of a short pass is generally to keep the ball low, so with your standing foot about hip width away from the ball, bring your kicking foot through and strike the middle of the ball with the inside of your foot. Keeping the ball low makes it easier to control. Follow through with the kicking leg. This will also help to increase the accuracy of the pass. It is good to hold the arm out from the body to improve balance.
According to Gentile's two-dimensional taxonomy, the initial practicing of the skill will be classified as a 14. This is because the regulatory conditions will be moving and variable, except there will only be object manipulation and no body transportation, as the ball will be stationary. As we move on to more advanced training and even game situations, the skill will be classified as a 16, as the person will have to move towards the ball. A retention test is used to determine if the learner has improved on the skill that has been practiced during the training program. For our test, we placed 2 cones 1 meter apart. The learner was 8 meters away and the ball was given to them. They then attempted to pass the stationary ball through the 2 cones. This was repeated 5 times on the left foot and the right foot, and the amount of successful trials was recorded. The pass was considered successful if the ball made it through without touching either cone. The learner was also given a subjective qualitative measure out of 10 for each pass, where the teacher ranked how good the pass was based on the technical elements such as speed of the pass, body position, and whether or not the ball travelled smoothly along the grass. A transfer test is used to determine if the training program has resulted in improvements in a different task. The test shows us whether or not the learner can successfully adapt to new conditions. For our test, 2 cones were set up 1 meter apart. The learner was 5 meters away and the ball was slowly rolled towards them. They then attempted to pass the ball, first time without controlling it, through the center of the cones. This was repeated 5 times on the left foot and the right foot, and the number of successful trials was recorded. A qualitative measure of technique was also recorded for each pass. A more advanced transfer test was also performed. For this test, the learner dribbled around cones and then passed the ball and aimed for a target. This tested the learner's ability to respond to external stimuli while still performing a successful pass. This test is a lot closer to a real game situation. There are 3 stages of learning: the cognitive, associative, and autonomous stages. As our learner was a beginner and had never played soccer before, she is still in the cognitive phase of learning. We predict that by the end of the 4-week program, she should be in the associative phase. For the cognitive stage, observation and verbal feedback are very important. The learner makes many gross errors, and it is important to allow the learner to learn through practice rather than constantly providing feedback. During the associative phase, the learner does not have to focus as much on the basic elements of the skill and can therefore focus on more advanced things such as direction of the pass, pace of the pass, and setting up the ball with the first touch. This was done in our program by doing 2-touch passing with a moving partner and also incorporating a dribbling element into a passing drill. The final phase of learning is autonomous. Basic elements of the skill become automatic for autonomous learners. This allows them to focus on other elements of the skill and of the match. Key characteristics of learners in the autonomous phase are consistency and very few errors. Our learner is not expected to reach this phase within the 4-week program.
Our use of transfer learning was the one-touch pass, then incorporating a component to make it game-like conditions. There are 2 situations. Procedural learning was the one that we focused on. First stage, which is improving in minutes, and the slow stage, which is practicing. There are 4 subcomponents of a skill that would be used to determine similarities and differences in transfer of learning. The first one is fundamental movement pattern, strategic and conceptual aspects, perceptual elements, and temporal and spatial elements. Our first one was kicking a soccer ball, then played on a soccer pitch, tracking the ball, and spatial awareness and timing. Attention. Attention needs to be very specific to the individual. Attention has its capacities, its limitation, and selection. Selection to people's interests. It also has a bottleneck theory, so only a certain amount of information can be received at once before it slows down. Attention is more of a low demand than a high, considering that the person isn't a professional soccer player.
Both quantitative and qualitative goals have been set for this program. The quantitative goal is that the participant should be hitting 4 out of 5 targets with their right foot and 3 out of 5 targets with their left foot by the end of the 4-week program. The qualitative goal is that the ball stays on the ground for 5 out of 5 passes.
A variety of practice is measured into mental and physical. Mental is imagery ability, and it involves imagination, internal and external. External imagination demonstrates the observation of skill. Most are beneficial before and after practice of motor skill. Both mental and physical practice is the optimal learning of motor skill. Neuromuscular explanation theory is the muscles that have a memory too in performing motor skills. Demonstrations need to be done correctly, as the learning subconsciously seeks key motor skill movements. Witness patterns are harder to relearn. Demonstrations should be kept throughout learning phase. Cognitive mediation theory is observing demonstrations, translates movement into memory, and forms primary representation of the skill. Dynamic view of modelling is a visual system automatically converts observed movements into the motor control system. Verbal cues are very important and was used throughout this motor control skill. One specifically was keep it on the deck. It's very important not to overload the learner for too many cues. It needs to be kept simple, key elements, and synchronise verbal cues with motor skill. Demonstrating and verbal cues come hand in hand.
There are 2 main types of feedback, task intrinsic and augmented. Task intrinsic feedback is sensory perceptual information and can be split into 4 components. These are visual, auditory, proprioceptive, and tactile. Augmented feedback comes from an external source. In our case, this is a coach. It is split into 2 components, knowledge of performance, being a measure of how well the task is performed technically, and knowledge of results, which is a measure of the success of the task performed, for example, whether or not the ball goes through the cones. As the learner is in the cognitive stage of learning, they must first observe the task with no verbal instructions. The learner then attempts the skill and is provided feedback throughout. Across the program, the feedback is then faded out in order to avoid the guidance hypothesis. The guidance hypothesis is when the learner becomes overly dependent on the feedback and is therefore unable to problem solve on their own. This is avoided by gradually providing less feedback. For soccer passing, whole practice should be used as the task is low in complexity and high in organisation. This means that the task is completed very quickly and is governed by a single motor program. The task has been simplified for the initial stages of practice to allow the learner to become comfortable with the fundamentals. This has been done by using a stationary ball and no opponent. Variation is essential in the learning of a skill. Without variation, the learner will only be able to perform a skill in the context it was learned in. For example, if the only practice that is done is passing a stationary ball into a target with no opponent, it is unlikely that the learner will improve in a matchday situation. In order to introduce practice variability, there are 3 variables that can be modified. These are skill, physical context, and situation. The skill has been modified in several ways, such as 1-touch and 2-touch passing, as well as passing after dribbling. The physical context and situation have been modified by passing both with a partner and against a wall. Practice variability results in more errors early on in the program. However, it also leads to better retention in the long term. Block practice was used early on in the program as it has low contextual interference and allows the learner to become competent in passing a ball. Random practice was included later on in the program, with 1-touch passing, 2-touch passing, and passing with an opponent incorporated into the program. Block practice is still performed throughout in order to provide direct practice for a specific skill. This is because the learner is still likely to be in the intermediate stage. Once they are in the elite stage, they can move on to random practice only. Random practice results in better retention long term.